Well, folks, let me tell you this. On the 1st of October 2025, in the heart of New York City, the marble halls of the United Nations trembled with words sharper than any sword. A young president from a small landlocked nation rose from his seat, fixed his eyes on the guardians of global finance, and declared without hesitation, "Africa owes you nothing." It was like David pointing his finger at Goliath. Not with a stone, but with truth. Before hundreds of television cameras, before the officials of the International Monetary Fund themselves, Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso put the system on trial. Not quietly, not politely, but with the kind of defiance that can shake empires. For many in the hall, it felt like history itself had stepped back into the room. Some whispered the name of Thomas Sankara, the leader who once dared to say the same words before being silenced forever. Yet here it was again, the old defiance reborn in the voice of a soldier president. And so the question falls to us. Is this the spark of a new chapter for Africa? Or a moment destined to be crushed by the weight of death and power? Would you dare to stand with him? Think about it. The chamber of the United Nations that morning was a cathedral of power. Flags from every nation hung in solemn silence. Delegates whispered in anticipation. And the cameras of the world were trained on a long wooden podium. It was supposed to be a routine debate on debt restructuring. In reality, everyone in the room knew the agenda had one word written all over Africa. Seated near the front was Ibrahim Traoré, the young soldier president of Burkina Faso. His presence alone drew whispers. He wore not a tailored suit, but a simple military jacket, a reminder that he had risen not through luxury, but through battlefields. As the chairman introduced the session, Traoré slowly stood. His movements were deliberate, his gaze steady. He unfolded a piece of paper, but before even glancing at it, he looked straight at the officials of the International Monetary Fund, and then he spoke words that would echo far. "Beyond that, whole Africa owes you nothing. It is you who owe us the truth." Gasps spread across the chamber. For decades, African leaders had couched their grievances in careful language, appealing for assistance, negotiating for relief. But here was a leader refusing to plead. Instead, he accused. He raised his voice, and what followed was not the speech, but an indictment. He called it the 7 crimes of the IMF in West Africa. First, he spoke of the endless debt traps in Ghana and Ivory Coast. He reminded the whole that Ghana was still buried under $3 billion bailout from 2022, with obligations to the IMF amounting to over 2.7 billion special drawing rights. As of this very year, instead of investing in its people, Ghana was sending interest payments abroad. Ivory Coast, he said, carried its own heavy chains of debt, its future mortgage to international creditors. Second, he denounced the forced privatization of Ghana's most precious wealth, the cocoa industry. Once the pride of farmers and the backbone of the economy, it had been handed to foreign corporations. The farmers, he said, were left with crumbs while the profits sailed overseas. Third, his voice sharpened as he described the cruel cuts to social services in Mali and Senegal. IMF conditions had demanded slash budgets for health and education. The results were visible. Children in Mali went hungry while hospitals in Senegal decayed for lack of funds. Fourth, he turned to Nigeria, recalling the devastating devaluation of the Naira in 1986. That collapse order-head under IMF conditions had destroyed the middle class almost overnight. Prices of imports exploded. Inflation devoured wages and millions were plunged into poverty. Fifth, he spoke of Liberia and Sierra Leone, where IMF loans continued to flow despite governments riddled with corruption. Citizens never saw the benefits. They inherited mountains of debt with no step forward in development. Sixth, he pointed to his own homeland, Burkina Faso. Under IMF guidance, the nation was encouraged to export raw gold rather than build local industries. The result was inevitable. Profits fled to multinational companies while his people remained poor, watching their land stripped of treasure. Seventh, he ended with Niger, where IMF conditions forced the opening of electricity and telecommunications to foreign investors. In the process, Niger lost control over its most strategic sectors. Independence had been traded for survival. With each indictment, the tension grew heavier. Delegates shifted in their seats. IMF officials stared down at their papers, avoiding his eyes. Then came the words that cut deepest. "This is not about money. This is about honor, about the dignity of Africa." For a moment, silence hung like a storm cloud. Then, as if on cue, applause erupted from the African delegations. The thunder of clapping hands rolled through the chamber. Yet the IMF's row remained frozen, their silence louder than any rebuttal. In that instant, a soldier president from one of the poorest nations on earth had forced the most powerful financial institution into speechless stillness. Cameras, flash journalists scribbled, and millions watching live around the world felt a strange jolt. Could this be the beginning of something larger? The scene closed not with resolution, but with uncertainty. Traore had spoken like David challenging Goliath. But history is filled with Davids who did not survive the battle. And so the question lingered in the air, unanswered, almost unbearable. Was this courage or was it suicide? The applause did not stop. It grew wave after wave, as if the walls of the United Nations themselves were echoing back the defiance of one man. Delegates from Mali and Guinea stood to clap. Some smiled openly, some nodded in silence, but all understood the weight of what had just been said. On the other side of the hall, officials sat rigid. Their hands never moved. Their silence was deafening. And yet, the real storm was not inside that chamber. It was outside. Within minutes, Traoré's words spread across Africa. Television screens flickered in Accra radios, crackled in the car phones, buzzed in Ouagadougou. In a Guinean cafe where cocoa farmers gathered for tea, a man raised his fist when he heard, "We owe you nothing." In a village in Mali, mothers huddled with their children around an old radio, their eyes filling with tears as they heard someone finally speak their truth. Commentators on African stations compared Traoré's defiance to a ghost from the past. Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of the 1980s Sankuro, had once declared that is a cleverly managed reconquest of Africa, and he had paid for those words with his life. Now, nearly 40 years later, another young president from the same land had stood in the same spirit. Many whispered history was not repeating itself. It was continuing. In Accra, a journalist reminded viewers that Ghana still owed more than 2.7 billion SDRs to the IMF and carried one of the heaviest debt burdens in Africa. In Lagos, scholars phoned into radio programs saying he speaks for us all. In Ouagadougou, murals of Traoré began appearing overnight, painted by young artists alongside the face of Sankara. Two soldiers bound together across generations. But even as joy rippled through the streets, there was fear. Analysts warned that the IMF could retaliate by cutting aid or tightening credit. International investors might demand higher interest rates, making loans even more expensive. Aid agencies quietly cautioned that food programs could shrink. The defiance was exhilarating, but its price could be hunger. Still, the energy of the moment was unstoppable. People repeated his words not just as a quote, but as a vow. This is about dignity, not money. Mothers whispered it to their children. Teachers wrote it on chalkboards, and soldiers at checkpoints muttered it like a prayer. For the first time in decades, ordinary citizens felt represented, and their unity was stronger than their fear. Inside the chamber, one detail passed almost unnoticed. As the applause rang on, a delegate from Niger leaned toward the representative of Mali and whispered about forming a joint declaration with Burkina Faso. Within hours, word spread in the corridors. Africa might stand as one to demand new terms with the IMF. What had begun as one man's speech was already growing into strategy. And then, just as the chamber began to quiet, the silence of the IMF still hung in the air. They shuffled their papers, avoided eye contact, and offered no reply. To many, watching that silence felt like an admission, a sign that the mighty institution had no answer. Now imagine for a moment that you were there sitting in that hall watching as a lone president pointed his finger at the IMF and accused them of crimes. The applause thunders all around. You but the guardians of global finance sit in stone-faced silence. What would you do? Would you join the clapping hands, or would you keep your palms, still afraid of what it might mean? In the hours that followed, the glow of triumph spread like wildfire. News outlets across Africa replayed the clip of Ibrahim Traoré standing tall, his finger raised toward the IMF. Commentators called it a turning point, a break in the long silence of dependency. In Bamako, in Niamey and Conakry, diplomats began to whisper of unity. Within a single day, delegates from Mali, Niger, and Guinea reached out to Burkina Faso's team, proposing a bold idea, a joint African strategy to confront the IMF together. What had started as a solitary defiance was already mutating into a collective front. On the streets of Ouagadougou, people poured out, not to protest, but to celebrate. Drums sounded, flags waved, and children painted slogans on the walls. Africa owes nothing. That night, young artists worked by candlelight painting murals of Traoré's face beside Thomas Sankara's two soldier presidents, separated by 4 decades, bound by the same defiance. The city pulsed with a sense of victory, fragile yet intoxicating. Even beyond Burkina Faso, the fire burned. In Ghana University, students wrote essays online calling for their government to revisit its $3 billion IMF bailout. In Lagos, small groups of activists held rallies, with banners demanding independence. from foreign dictates. On social media, hashtags calling for dignity trended from Dakar to Johannesburg. But with the light came shadows. In the financial markets of London and New York, investors watched uneasily. Some banks hinted at raising interest rates on African loans. Aid groups quietly warned that food programs could shrink if donations grew hostile. Analysts pointed to the brutal mathematics. The average debt to GDP ratio in sub-Saharan Africa was already more than 60% according to IMF data. If credit was cut off, millions might suffer overnight. In Burkina Faso, the government braced itself. Advisors debated how to secure grain imports if subsidies were withdrawn. Ministers worried about the rising cost of fuel, the fragility of the currency, and the possibility of sanctions. Some urged caution, even retreat. Yet Traore himself remained unmoved. In a televised address days later, he told his people, "This fight is larger than numbers on a balance sheet. It is about dignity, and dignity cannot be measured in dollars or special drawing rights. For ordinary citizens, the clarity mattered. Market women in Ouagadougou say they would endure hardship if it meant independence from foreign control. Teachers often unpaid for months declared that hope gave meaning to their sacrifices. Soldiers at dusty checkpoints repeated the president's words like a chant. A sense of shared purpose was taking root, fragile but undeniable. The paradox was impossible to ignore. The more danger loomed, the more unity grew. The IMF could punish, the markets could squeeze. But for now, the people of West Africa were not bending. Still, one question could not be escaped. Could dignity truly endure when the hunger bills arrived? In Burkina Faso, the echoes of Traoré's words did not fade. They seeped into classrooms, markets, churches, a military barracks. Teachers long weary of empty paychecks scribbled his line on chalkboards. "This is about dignity, not money." Mothers repeated it at bedtime, whispering into the ears of their children as if it were a blessing. Soldiers at roadside checkpoints, dusty rifles slung across their backs, greeted travelers, not with suspicion but with pride, murmuring, "We owe nothing." The ripple extended across West Africa in Ghana, where memories of IMF bailouts were bitter. Students filled lecture halls to debate alternatives. Young economists posted essays online demanding an end to endless borrowing. Some cited cold numbers. Ghana's debt had soared to over 90% of GDP by 2022, leaving the country shackled to repayment. Others cited emotion. "Our cocoa fit the world and yet we remain poor." The words of their neighbor's president gave shape to their frustration. In Lagos civil society, groups staged small rallies holding banners painted in bold strokes. "Africa owes nothing." Though the gatherings were modest, the symbolism was potent. Across the continent, whispers turned into conversations and conversations into chants. But perhaps the most unexpected, resonance came thousands of miles away across the Atlantic. In the United States, the diaspora listened. At Howard University in Washington, professors gathered their students to watch the replay. They dissected Traoré's speech alongside the words of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and even Frederick Douglass. In the sermons of Harlem, pastors invoked his defiance as a spiritual stand against oppression, connecting Africa's dignity to the long struggle for justice in America. In Atlanta, choirs sang of freedom, weaving Traoré's words into hymns. On talk radio programs, callers debated fiercely. Some asked whether the United States had used the IMF as an instrument of influence for too long. Others worried that cutting ties to global finance would leave Africa more vulnerable. Still, the admiration was undeniable. For many African-Americans, it was the first time in years that the leader from the continent had captured international headlines, not as a victim of crisis, but as a voice of defiance. The diaspora joined the momentum. Young entrepreneurs in New York and Los Angeles posted messages of solidarity online. Community groups held forums asking how Africans abroad could support movements for financial independence at home. Scholars described the speech as breaking the silence of dependency. For once, Africa was not seen as begging but as demanding. This was not mere applause. It was a shift in consciousness. A young leader from a small landlocked nation had rekindled pride across a continent and stirred solidarity in distant lands. In Kathy's classrooms and churches, the message was clear. Africa's dignity was no longer negotiable. But pride alone does not rewrite contracts, nor does applause erase debt. Behind closed doors, leaders in Washington, Paris, and Brussels watched carefully. Their silence for now was strategic. They weighed how to respond not only to Burkina Faso, but to a movement that might soon sweep across Africa. The question lingered in the air like smoke after a gunshot. When the great powers finally spoke, would they crush this spark, or would they fan it into flame? In Washington, the official response came swiftly, though carefully worded. The State Department called President Tia's remarks reckless and warned that they could destabilize the fragile Sahel region. Officials reminded reporters that Burkina Faso remained heavily dependent on external assistance and that antagonizing international institutions would only deepen its hardship. Behind closed doors, however, the mood was sharper. Policymakers admitted what few dared say aloud. For decades, the United States had relied on the IMF and the World Bank as instruments of influence. To see a young African president defy them on a global stage was unsettling, even threatening. Some feared it could embolden others, triggering a wave of resistance across the continent. Yet outside of government circles, the reaction was different. African-American intellectual students and pastors celebrated Traoré's courage. At Cornell, professors of African studies compared his words to the Boston Tea Party, a rebellion not against taxation, but against financial servitude. At Howard, young scholars debated whether this was Africa's declaration of independence. In the 21st century, in churches across Atlanta and Harlem, pastors repeated his line, "This is about dignity, not money." It rang like scripture. The American media mirrored the divide. Major outlets like the Washington Post warned of financial isolation and described Traoré's challenge as a gamble. But smaller publications, independent commentators, and talk radio hosts praised his defiance as historic. Callers phoned in asking a question that cut to the bone. If Africa owes nothing, who then owes Africa? Across the Atlantic, Europe reacted with unease. In Paris, commentators called the speech dangerously nationalistic, warning that it might fracture financial ties built over decades. In Brussels, officials urged stability and cooperation, but their words carried a tremor of alarm. For them, there was not merely an institution, it was a pillar of global order. To see it questioned so openly was unsettling, even humiliating. Meanwhile, Moscow and Beijing seized the moment. Russian media hailed Traoré as a revolutionary, heir to the anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century. Chinese state outlets contrasted their no-strings infrastructure, loans with IMF austerity, suggesting that Africa's future lay with new partners. It is important to note, as some analysts cautioned, that not every detail about debt figures and negotiations can be independently verified. Reports circulated quickly, sometimes ahead of confirmation. But the overall truth remained undeniable. The world was watching divided, and the young soldier president had cracked open a debate no one could ignore. And so the question is passed on to us. If your ancestors could hear these words today, what would they say? The days after Traoré's speech felt less like aftermath and more like the opening act of something larger. In Addis Ababa, at a special session of the African Union, several heads of state quoted his words about dignity and honor. They debated not whether to oppose the IMF, but how. Proposals emerged for an African sovereignty fund, a shared pool of resources designed to replace reliance on foreign loans. For the first time in decades, unity had a concrete financial vision. On the streets, the momentum was even stronger. In Dhaka, students marched with signs declaring Africa owes nothing. In Laga civil society, groups demanded their leaders re-examine old IMF agreements. In Ouagadougou, the murals of Traoré multiplied. His image painted alongside Sankara Lumumba and Nkrumah as if he were already bound into the pantheon of Africa's defiant sons. Musicians composed songs of resistance, weaving his words into choruses sung in marketplaces and bars. School children memorized his lines as if they were proverbs. The cultural shift was unmistakable. Africa was no longer asking for permission. It was claiming a voice, but the risk grew equally fast. International investors whispered about raising borrowing costs for African nations. Aid groups cautioned that food programs might shrink. IMF officials quietly circulated warnings that countries refusing compliance could lose access to emergency funding. And across fragile economies already battered by drought and inflation, such punishments could translate into hunger and despair. Burkina Faso's own ministers debated urgently. Some urged Traoré to soften his tone, fearing economic isolation. Others pressed for bold partnerships with Russia, China, or the BRICS bloc. Traoré himself, in a televised address, seemed unshaken. "This fight is larger than us," he told the nation. "We do not ask permission to be free. We have risen to claim it." Hope and fear now walked hand in hand. For ordinary people, the meaning was simple. They were willing to endure hardship. If it meant independence, a market woman in Ouagadougou told a reporter, "We have been poor for decades. If poverty is the price of the freedom, we will pay it." Analysts in Washington and Paris watched with unease. Some admitted privately that the IMF's credibility was shaken. What frightened them was not Burkina Faso alone, but the possibility that others would follow. Paris feared that centuries of the financial influence in West Africa might unravel. Moscow and Beijing meanwhile saw opportunity. Russian diplomats floated offers to host a summit on African debt alternatives. Chinese officials hinted at expanded credit lines through their own development banks. The global balance was tilting, and so the future remained uncertain. Would Traoré's defiance ignite a continental revolution, binding nations together in a new financial order? Or would the IMF and its allies tighten the screws, plunging millions into crisis? One truth was undeniable. A young soldier president had forced the world to listen. Whether it leads to freedom or famine, one thing is clear. Africa has found his voice, and now the question falls to you. Would you endure hunger if it meant dignity for generations to come? The image remains etched in memory. A young soldier president standing tall in the marble chamber of the United Nations, pointing his finger at the guardians of global finance. His words cracked through the silence like thunder. Africa owes you nothing. The applause that followed rolled out of that hole across the streets of Ouagadougou and into the hearts of millions, far beyond Africa. This was not just about debt. It was about dignity, something no ledger can measure, no contract can erase. For decades, Africa's voice was muffled beneath the weight of interest, payments, and austerity demands. But on that October day in New York, the silence was broken. It was not a request. It was a declaration. And yet, the struggle ahead is real. Poverty will not vanish overnight. Food insecurity, fragile economies, and political instability remain heavy burdens. The IMF and its allies may retaliate, and hardship could follow. But something deeper has been born. A belief that the continent's destiny belongs not to others, but to Africans themselves. So the question lingers hanging in the air like a vow. Will this fire grow into a revolution of dignity? Or will it be smothered by fear and hunger? If his words touch your heart, leave one word in the comments: dignity. Let the words see that you heard him. And if you want to follow this story as it unfolds, join us, subscribe, and walk with us on this journey toward a future where no nation bows its head to death. Because as Traoré said that day, we do not ask permission to be free. We have reason to claim it. God bless Africa.